All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Roger Holland. I'm on the faculty of the Lamont School of Music here at the University of Denver. And I'm also the director of the Spirituals Project. And we are delighted to have had a hand in today's presentation on sonic resistance, Indigenous women, and social justice. Now, you may be asking yourselves, well, what does the activity of indigenous people have to do with spirituals and African Americans in this country? Well, I'm glad you asked, and let me tell you where I see the connections, and hopefully you'll make that connection with me. So, the music of the spirituals grew out of the period of slavery here in the United States in the 18th and 19th centuries. And music was used by the enslaved African community as a means of sustaining who they were, sustaining community, giving voice to and expression to their experience of slavery, and in many ways as acts of resistance, rebellion, and helping them to find a way to gain or to empower freedom and liberty for themselves and others in the community. And for me, that is certainly analogous, and we can see the connection between other communities, indigenous communities, and how they have used sound, performance, dance, other kinds of artistic expressions to give voice, power, and to facilitate resistance and liberation. And it is with that in mind that I am so excited to have been able to partner with doctors Angela Parker and Veronica Pacheco, who is also a postdoc fellow working with the Spirituals Project. So we welcome you today to this exciting webinar. We have an exciting list of panelists who have gathered to share with us their expertise and their experiences. And I don't want to talk too much longer, except to say that I cannot wait to see what our guests have to share with us. Once again, very much gratitude to Veronica Pacheco and Angela Parker, part of our family here at the University of Denver, for their work in putting this panel together. I would also like to thank the ODEI committee, our organization here, iRise for their support, and the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences for their support. In addition, let me also thank our DUIT department for your support this webinar panel today. Thank you to all who have gathered. Thank you to all who have worked behind the scenes to put this together. That being said, I'd like to turn over my time and this platform to Dr. Angela Parker.
Hi, Roger. Thank you so much. And I feel like this has been such a great project to be working on as springtime blooms and as we start to think about new possibilities as COVID begins to loosen its hold, at least in the US. Before we move into the main panel, and I'm sort of the usher that's going to bring our audience into that panel, I wanted to give a few directions about translation functions that are available during the panel. So we will have panelists speaking in both English and Spanish throughout the webinar. And there is audio available in both languages. So to access translations, locate the sort of globe icon in the Zoom controls at the bottom of your screen. And if you want to hear the event in Spanish, you can click that little global icon that has interpretation under it, and you can choose Spanish. If you want to hear the event in English, you can click English after you click on that interpretation icon. So we will have those directions in the chat, perhaps more clearly than I just read them out. And so those will be reposted in the chat every now and then if you do want to access them at a later point. So I'm moving now to a land acknowledgement, and particularly in the US, but I think globally, wherever there are significant Indigenous communities, this has become a very common way of opening up a panel or a workshop such as this. And I want us to, as we're doing this land acknowledgement, take a deep breath and give ourselves permission to spend some time thinking about the concepts that I'm going to lead us through for a few minutes. We don't have to rush. And it's especially important because we're preparing to move into a virtual place of intellectual and cultural reciprocity. Um, Conversations like this one that span tribal, national, and linguistic boundaries don't happen often enough. And part of what this land acknowledgement aims for is just sort of clear the space to allow us to have these connections in a good way. So, a little positionality. I'm a professor here in the history department. I'm Mandan, Hidatsa, and Cree, which are tribes from North Dakota and Montana, and I'm far outside of my homelands. And I'm still learning. I'm still learning about this landscape in which I now live, in which I work. I'm educating myself about the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho communities that once and still live on this land before they were largely violently displaced by US colonialism. And I want to acknowledge and just honor the fact that I have a long way to go in my education. So I'm giving this land acknowledgement from a stance of deep humility and learning. So, with that preface, I want to say let's take some time mentally and emotionally to honor the people that have come before us. I want to honor the troublemakers and the freedom fighters and the family builders and the res chicks and the grandmas who have worked and given up time, energy, and love to allow us to share this space today. I want to honor the histories and the survivance of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute peoples whose land we are both actually and virtually on right now. And finally, I want to honor the connections that will be continued to be rebuilt between Indigenous communities separated by national boundaries. As our women, as our leaders, and as our peoples continue our progress toward healing and justice. So thank you for giving me that space to give that land acknowledgement. And we're going to start transitioning into the panel right now. So I want to welcome all of our panelists. I'm going to read short biographies of them, short bios, and hopefully as you continue to sit through this panel and to think through the concepts, you'll learn much more about our panelists because I think it's a roster of really amazing Indigenous women. So first of all, I want to introduce Dr. Veronica Pacheco. She is an ethnomusicologist who specializes in ritual music of Indigenous peoples of Mexico, as well as other musical genres of Latin America and the Middle East. She received her PhD in ethnomusicology from the University of California, Los Angeles. And her research interests include music and the politics of participation, collective performances of music as registers of Indigenous history, and the intersections of Indigenous sustainability and cultural rights. She directs two research initiatives in Mexico, the Nahua Religious Music Project and the Urban Soundscapes Project. Our next panelist, Vicki Eagle, is a second year doctoral student on Tongva, I'm probably mispronouncing that, land in the Department of Anthropology, also at UCLA. Her doctoral project focuses on Native American heavy metal bands in a genre called res metal from the Southwest Four Corners area. And res metal is an intertribal Indigenous subculture that engages in social justice through metal music. Her project speaks to Gen Xers, Millennial, and Gen Z Native youth, in particular because of their overarching passion for music and the arts. Vicky comes from the Sichangu, she's going to correct me on this, hopefully, Lakota, and is also half Japanese. We also would like to welcome Dr. Jacinta Toribio Torres, who is Nawa and was born in, and I'm going to mispronounce these as well, so my apologies in advance, Tepenahuac, Chicontepec in Veracruz. She's research faculty at the Universidad Veracruzana Intercultural, UVI, where she coordinates the Intercultural Management and Development Program for the bachelor's degree. The MA program in Nahuatl language and culture. And her research focuses on land tenure transformations of Chicontepec and Ixhuatlan de Madero's indigenous peoples and communities during the 19th and 20th centuries. She's currently developing projects of language and cultural revitalization of the original peoples of Ixhuatlan de Madero, Veracruz. Dr. Toribio Torres obtained her doctorate degree in history and regional studies from the Universidad Veracruzana, her MA in history and regional studies from the Colegio de San Luis, and her bachelor's degrees in educational sciences with a specialty in social sciences from the Autonomous University of Tamaulipas, and my apologies for mispronunciations. Finally, I'd like to welcome Dr. Brenda Child, Ojibwe, Dr. Brenda Child, who is Ojibwe, who is a Northrop Professor of American Studies at the University of Minnesota. She is the author of award-winning and widely read books of American Indian history, including Boarding School Seasons, American Indian Families, which won the North American Indian Prose Award, as well as Holding Our World Together, Ojibwe Women and the Survival of Community, and Indian Subjects, Hemispheric Perspectives on the History of Indigenous Education. Her 2014 book, My Grandfather's Knocking Sticks, Ojibwe Family Life and Labor on the Reservation, won the American Indian Book Award and the Best Book in Midwestern History. She served as a member of the Board of Trustees of the National Museum of the American Indian and was president of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association. Dr. Child was born on the Red Lake Ojibwe Reservation in northern Minnesota, where she has also served as a member of a committee writing a new constitution for the 12,000 member nation. So please join me in welcoming all of our amazing panelists. I'd like to turn first to Dr. Child so that she can give a brief presentation. We're going to start by each of the panelists talking through some of their research and their sources. And then we'll come together for some initial discussion questions before we turn it over to audience questions. I would encourage any audience members, as the panelists are speaking, to submit any questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And then we'll be able to sort of consolidate, sift through, or to highlight different questions that you may submit there. So thank you very much to all of our panelists. And Dr. Child, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Angela. Thank you for that nice introduction. And I am going to be talking a little bit about the jingle dress dance tradition, which is something indigenous to my part of the country. And it's also something that I think has special relevance to the time we're living through now. So I'll try to keep my eye on the time with this. But so this is a photograph that you can see, Red Lake Ojibwe. This is from my community, probably about 90, maybe about 90 years ago, something like that. It would be the date on this photograph. And you see in this picture, there are women and girls dressed in what we call jingle dresses. So the jingle dress dance is an Ojibwe tradition that's now about a century old. It has evolved to become part of the social life and ritual of powwows, but also other kinds of dances, like the big drum ceremonies that we have here in Minnesota and Wisconsin. The jingle dress dance is indigenous to Ojibwe people of both the United States and Canada. And it actually became a Dakota tradition fairly early on. And the Dakota people, where I live here in Minnesota, the Dakota people live in the southern part of Minnesota, and they are some of our closest neighbors. In recent decades, so since say the 1980s or so, the jingle dress dance began to be widely adopted by other Indigenous women. The jingle dress dance tradition is about healing the body, but also the mind, especially in the aftermath of grief. And in that sense, it is profoundly about love. Love for your relatives and community, and even love for those who have left this world. In this year of loss, perhaps more than any other time in our lives, we can better understand the suffering of people who survived the pandemic of 1918-19, which is the origin of the jingle dress dance. And it was a tradition, now a tradition, or the pandemic, I should say, itself was deeply felt in Ojibwe country of the US and Canada. The Ojibwe jingle dress dance was once a new tradition. It has endured and evolved to fit the needs of people over time. I first learned about the jingle dress dance because my own grandmother was a jingle dress dancer nearly all her life. Her name is Jeanette Aganash. She has been a very large figure in my life and inspired my first book called Boarding School Seasons. But she was a jingle dress dancer. And so that's where I first learned about this tradition. My grandmother would have been a teenager during the time of the pandemic of 1918-19, but the tradition always stayed with her throughout her life. She lived into her 80s, and it was very much part of her identity as an Ojibwe woman. Here in the Great Lakes, the homeland of about 200,000 Ojibwe people, so half of us live in Canada, the other half live in the United States. The Anishinaabe have deeply integrated the memory of this epidemic into our traditions of song and dance. So I'm interested in the tradition as an Ojibwe woman, but I'm also interested in it as a historian. And it's fascinating. It's been fascinating to me that we carry this very strong historical memory of the pandemic of 1918. Because every time the jingle dress dance is performed, I argue, we are remembering the worldwide epidemic of influenza that spread in 3 waves in the spring and fall of 1918 and the winter of 1919, killing 30 to 50 million people worldwide. So keep in mind that this pandemic, and we've been learning about pandemics this past year, this pandemic killed more people globally than the First World War. Until now, I mean, US historians often say that the pandemic has been an event strangely without a strong historical memory in the US, despite the loss of 675,000 lives. And think about our own numbers. I don't know what we're at today, but with this current pandemic, I know we recently passed the milestone of 500,000 deaths, right, in the United States alone. So it has been quite a fascinating, for me as a scholar studying the history of the jingle dress dance tradition, it's been very interesting to kind of experience this global pandemic that we're in. And if you go on to the next slide, the jingle dress dance is And when it was introduced, it was an innovation. And in this next slide, I wanted to show you a couple of images. Yeah, I wanted to show you a couple of images because even before the pandemic, my students and I at the University of Minnesota were working on an exhibit to kind of acknowledge, if not celebrate, I don't know if that's quite the right word, but to acknowledge this tradition that came out of the influenza. So this exhibit opened up in a small museum up on the Mille Lacs Reservation in central Minnesota, which is the Minnesota site of the origin of the jingle dress dance tradition. And we wanted to kind of explore the dresses and talk about the pandemic, because a lot of people today may not recall its origins in the pandemic, even though we recall in stories a story of a little girl who became very ill. And as we also just kind of acknowledge very widely in our communities that it is a very strong healing tradition. So we opened in the spring of 2019. Little did we know the exhibit would close in the next year because of a second global pandemic. When the jingle dress dance was introduced, it was an innovation, but one consistent with Ojibwe spiritual practices and our traditions of song and dance. But I also find it useful to think of the jingle dress dance as an anti-colonial movement. So in a small exhibit, we were trying to do two things: show dresses over the decades from Ojibwe communities, but we were also trying to talk about its roots in the pandemic of 1918. But then you see this other picture here, which shows women at Standing Rock, which was another important part of what we wanted to get across with this exhibit. So the jingle dress dance to me is an anti-colonial movement, because when you look at its origins, this new practice organized and flourished under the Indian office ban on ritualistic dance a century ago. An infamous circular from the Office of Indian Affairs and the Department of the Interior was sent to reservations in the spring of 1921 with the following message, quote, "The dance, however, under most primitive and pagan conditions, is apt to be harmful. And when found to be so among the Indians, we should control it by educational processes as far as possible, but if necessary, by punitive measures when its degrading tendencies persist." So in the early 1920s and earlier, throughout that, kind of 50-year, that half century of assimilation policy in the United States, American Indian ritualistic dance was being suppressed on reservations. And it kind of peaked, I think, in the early 1920s with this well-known dance order, as historians often refer to it, that came from the Indian office. And so I think most people don't realize the extent to which American Indian spiritual traditions were suppressed in the history of the United States. But part of what we wanted to do with this exhibit then was to talk about the roots of the jingle dress dance tradition and to show that even though it has been really popular in protest movements like Standing Rock and other, Idle No More in Canada, we know that it has been around for a very long time, and that it's these kind of radical roots of the jingle dress tradition coming, sort of being invented and created at the same time as the dance orders from Washington show, I think, that it always had a kind of radical anti-colonial beginning. And so it hasn't been difficult then for women to adapt it to new social movements. So American Indians, I should also say, responded to the dance order in the early 20th century. They wrote letters to the Indian office, and they continued to dance, which was probably the greatest way in which they showed their resistance. The San Ildefonso Pueblo headman wrote a letter saying, "What? Dance is our opera, our drama, our art." And so in this context, Ojibwe women in the US and Canada continued to spread the jingle dress tradition. They knew that art is medicine. I'll just show you another slide here. One more, if you'd advance it one more. So we outlasted the dance order of the early 20th century. Now the healing power of music is no longer a belief confined to Indigenous people of the United States and Canada. Interestingly, the jingle dress dance did not disappear, but during the 1980s, it made a great leap as it evolved from a regional tradition primarily practiced by small numbers of elderly women, like my own grandmother, to a flourishing pan-tribal performance with wide appeal across the generations. And yet it has maintained its integrity as a dance of healing. American Indian traditions of song and dance remain a powerful expression of cultural values. The jingle dress dance, a gift of healing from the Ojibwe people, has adapted and survived and continues to inspire Indigenous women in their communities. This photograph here, as well as the Standing Rock photograph, were taken by my colleague, Eugene Tapahi, who's Navajo, they're a Navajo family, and his daughters are jingle dress dancers. And this shows his daughters as well as two of their friends. And these are all young Navajo women. And this past summer, Eugene and his family were traveling around to the national parks, calling attention to the situation of murdered and missing women. And so that's what this photograph is all about. And if you would advance it to just one more slide. So if you'd like more information about the history of the Ojibwe jingle dress dance tradition, which has in recent decades become very widespread in North America, you can see my recent documentary called Jingle Dress Dancers in the Modern World, Ojibwe People in and Pandemics. We made it this past year in the College of Liberal Arts. Initially, it was just to be a little segment talking about my research, and then the pandemic happened. And so we added photographs, historic photographs, contemporary photographs. We took it up to the George Floyd protest in Minneapolis last spring, where Ojibwe women and other women from the community came out in that location, that space where Mr. Floyd was killed last year, and performed a jingle dress dance for healing. The film is just about, it's about 17 minutes long. It packs a lot of history. It's available free, and you can look at it. You can Google it under Jingle Dress Dancers in the Modern World, and you can find it on YouTube. And so I was hoping that my colleagues teaching online this year would be able to use it, and they have. So that's been really great. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Child. That is a really important and powerful history. So I'd like to turn next to Vicki Eagle, who is in the midst of field work in a very difficult time of the pandemic. It's a tough time to be doing field work, but somehow she's managing it. And it helps that she's had a deep level of engagement with community members in the population she's studying, which focuses on res metalheads.
Thank you, Angela, for your introduction. Everyone can hear me all right? We're in a good place? Okay, give me 1 second here. I'm gonna put on my PowerPoint. All right, thank you, Angela, for a wonderful introduction. Yeah, to pronounce my tribal affiliation is actually Sichangu Lakota. I'm actually from Denver, Colorado, but my family's from the Rosebud Sioux tribe in South Dakota. I'm excited to talk about my work, and this is actually the first time I'm kind of presenting my res metal work in relation to in an academic space that's like focused on women and focused on social justice in this platform. So I'm gonna ask for everyone to be forgiving for this. So let me put this on full screen. Okay, so my So my work is on what's considered res metal. I called my work Ancestors Res Metal and Indigenous Sonic Resistance. This logo is made by Johnny Nelson, who's Navajo, also is in the Denver, Colorado area, but originally from New Mexico, from Navajo Nation. I look to how, okay. Yeah, so I first want to acknowledge where my project started is actually at the University of Denver when I was experimenting with portraiture. So during the time when I was at DU, I started this series called Real Life Indian, wanting to talk about lived experiences of Native Americans on the University of Denver campus. At that time, it was less than 0.5% of the population, where now there's a lot of Native students on campus that are thriving. But during this time, when I was doing portraiture, I asked my friend, my friend Amanda here, how she would want to represent herself and how she wants to be seen. So she wore her Iron Maiden t-shirt. And this is where I have been thinking since 2012 about res metal, about heavy metal, about alternative culture in general. So I at least want to acknowledge like where this idea started, where it came from, and then where I ended up today here at UCLA in anthropology, studying this very, subfield in general. So first I'm going to move my window back over here. So right now I'm experimenting in the way Angela said, I'm in the midst of field work, still trying to get through comprehensive exams and still trying to frame my work. So right now I'm kind of experimenting within Indigenous sound studies. I'm looking at how to frame what an Indigenous sonic resistance is, and looking at how sonic resistance and how Indigenous ways of knowing are interconnected together. So I'm trying to frame an Indigenous sonic resistance rooted in relationality and Indigenous knowledge, that it embodies these things, and that the study particularly from the SAR website for Indigenizing Sound Studies asks a tenet of how to look at Indigenous sounds, right? That necessitates a break, a renaming, and a degree of epistemic disobedience or resistant to current power structures and trends in the field. So I've been looking at how heavy metal embodies these two, or res metal in general, in particular res metal embodies these two tenets, right? And how this is looked at in this particular presentation, how we're going to look at it from an Indigenous feminism and from gender studies. Okay, actually it only works here. So my work is actually situated, actually give me 1 second here. Let me actually go back here. Sorry about that. We're actually not ready for that slide. Okay, there we go. Okay, so yeah, I'll just leave it here, but my work is situated in New Mexico. So New Mexico is home to 23 sovereign nations, 19 pueblos, Navajo Nation, Hopi, parts of kind of like in general, this is where my work is taking place. Something that's always interesting within my work is looking at how border towns, checkerboard towns, and how Native people are kind of living within these spaces at this time, geographically speaking. Border towns are geographically located on state land, right? And that really complicates a lot of pretty much like how tribal jurisdiction and then also how state relations are kind of created in this space at this time. Let me go back here. Sorry, give me 1 second. Okay, so my work right now is looking at, and this is very recent, right, from the Urban Indian Health Institute, right, that lists both two border towns in New Mexico with the highest number of MMIW cases within Gallup and within Albuquerque, New Mexico. So New Mexico was named in this report within the top 10 cities with the highest number of MMIWG cases. And this totaled to about 78 cases. Oopsie, give me 1 second. Sorry, my like PowerPoint thing is like spazzing out here. Give me 1 second to start over. Sorry about technical difficulties. Okay. Okay, let me go back here. Oops. Sorry about that. Okay. Okay, play from current slide. Sorry about that. Okay, so it keeps freezing, so I really apologize about that. So I'm gonna come back to my topic right here real quickly. So I'm looking at the genre of heavy metals in the reservation. Res metals, res is like the short term. Okay, sorry. where was I at? Okay, so sorry. The genre of heavy metal emerged in the 1970s. Many scholars point to Black Sabbath as the first heavy metal band in the United States. Heavy metal began to impact American culture during the 1980s, especially on the reservation. Sounds such as the start of 1980s, more aggressive and faster style of metal, speed and thrash metal kind of came into the reservation. Res is like the acronym for res metal. And then as I situated my work within MMIW, I'm going to be talking about this band called Suspended, so the more interesting part of my research. Suspended is a three-piece thrash metal band, and they came out with a music video that is called The Beast Within. The Beast Within is, and it's also on the website if you all want to watch it, so I'm really excited for you all to also take a look at the sounds. The Beast Within, created by Chani Concho, who's Laguna and Hopi, Jessica Armstrong, who's Dene, and Amanda Castillo, who's mixed Indigenous descent from New Mexico. During this time, I was very much blown away to see three Indigenous women in a heavy metal band because growing up in Denver, this was something I didn't see. And I saw that they had strength, they had confidence, they had a sound that I've never heard before. And that was a sound of growls, of thrash, melodic tones, and this sound that really just blew me away. And when I heard The Beast Within, I looked at lyrics, I looked at the music video, and I really wanted to understand more about what it's like to be who they are and how they even came to be. Suspended's actually very popular in the New Mexico, Albuquerque regions. And I would ask them, like, you know, what kind of response do you get as women when you enter the heavy metal scene? And, you know, they say that people are supportive, but they also run into things like this comment here that are like, you know, hey, sweetie, why are you carrying your boyfriend's guitar? You know, stuff like that. Or, you know, things that say like, are you going to sound like Kitty? Or are you going to sound kind of like Baby Metal? And after they hear them play, a lot of people get blown away by their performance. And because of this, I really looked into their song lyrics and their words and wanted to understand more of where they were coming from and what message they were trying to create. So in the MMIW context, right, they actually created a video that would raise awareness, right, to talk about the missing, murdered Indigenous women. So MMIW, right, has been something that's been talked about within the past era since at least this video came out in 2016, but it's been something been talked about for a very long time. Given that we're in New Mexico and the recent reports show that they are, that these cases are actually the highest in the city, I started to look at their music video a little bit more in depth and how they performed, what sound they were creating, and what message they wanted to tell the public. And they also spend their time where they actually go volunteer at the MMIW rallies in Albuquerque. They perform for free for Native communities. And that's part of like this Indigenous sonic resistance that I'm looking at, is how Native people are singing songs, making sounds, right, that are actually gifts to the community, or that's actually to give back to the community in some way or form, or to encourage other women that they're here, right? And to also be in part of community at the same time, really speak back to what's happening to Native women in this time frame. So in 2016, when they created this video, it starts with a woman who's actually kidnapped, and she's tied up in this way with duct tape on her mouth, and you know, she gets kidnapped, she's brought here. But in the middle of the video, this woman actually breaks and releases from her ropes, from her bond, from her everything in this situation, and comes back with actually a revenge, right? And actually comes back, takes her and reclaims her power, is the way that Chani would describe it, to fight back against what's happening. So all of these things have been metaphorically part of, I think, like this, yeah, just this conversation and how it looks like now, especially with the Urban Indian Health Institute report. So this report was actually released in 2020, this past December, from the State of New Mexico Indian Affairs, that's looking at the missing, murdered Indigenous women and relative task force report that was just released. And then with their song, I kind of ask them a little bit more questions during my work, right? About, how is it rooted in relationality, and how does your sound and metal, heavy metal itself, right, speaks back as a resistance to these power structures through these sonic sounds. And Channy, replies about like how the goals of the band have been valued to uplift women in particular, and about how they want to be seen here as also good role models for the younger women, that they can do whatever they want as well and sound and be as heavy and be as like amazing as they are. And, she tells me that Beast Within is a great example of that, and how that it embodies, like, yes, it has this darker side, but towards the end, it revolves around, right, a woman not letting the male take over her and control her, or even get to the point of killing her. And she fights back, she gets up, she fights, and she gets her revenge. But also that, like, she wants that message that there are other women that, oh yeah, because she doesn't want this to happen to other women. And she wants to be that person to be able to break free and continue to go on for these women. So in this video, you'll see all of these themes that are in here, and how it alludes to the era right now of MMIW, who have also suffered from these realities, but how we can actually reclaim our power back into the situation. And they created this song, right, wanting to show that and to uplift women that they can fight back. So yeah, I apologize about my like stumbling earlier. I promise I'm usually more articulate, but given my presentation was just freezing, I was like freezing up as well. And yeah, so that is pretty much how I'm gonna end my presentation. Just trying to figure out how to like stop the share screen.
Thank you so much, Vicki. I think you did a great job, and no need to apologize whatsoever. And I just also want to bring your attention to the Q&A, because I think there's a question specifically for you that we'll address in the Q&A portion later. So our next panelist, Dr. Toribio Torres, prepared a video presentation, and hopefully she'll be able to join us via phone during the Q&A session. Unfortunately, we've had some technical difficulties, but luckily she was very well prepared and actually put together a video for us to watch.
Piali, muy buenas tardes a todos y todas. Quiero comenzar por agradecer mucho la amable invitación a una servidora para participar en este panel, al Instituto Interdisciplinario de Desigualdad de la Universidad de Denver, y en especial a las organizadoras, a la doctora Ángela Parker y a la doctora Verónica Pacheco. Muchas gracias. Bien, lo que yo hoy les voy a compartir a ustedes es el resultado de mi investigación doctoral, reconstrucción de comunidad en el municipio de Ixhuatlán de Madero, Veracruz, comuneros, ejidatarios, propietarios y campesinos ante los proyectos postrevolucionarios 1922-1992. Lo que quisimos fue entender las luchas y negociaciones cotidianas de la población originaria en relación con el Estado a partir de las diferentes propuestas de intervención, en el caso en específico de las políticas agrarias. Y consideramos que, ya que consideramos que estas políticas agrarias no son aplicadas de manera vertical, o bien que se se apliquen sin que haya una respuesta de parte de la población a quien va dirigida, y lo que yo encuentro más bien es a una población originaria con agencias propias arraigadas en la historia local, desde los cuales reciben, aceptan o rechazan de diversas maneras las propuestas estatales, de diversas maneras, y eso lo vamos a ver ahora en el caso en específico de la reforma agraria, que es una política agraria que fue echada a andar a partir de la ley 6 de enero de 1915 por Venustiano Carranza. Bueno, continúo. Bueno, Ixhuatlán de Madero está al norte del estado de Veracruz. Forma parte también de lo que se le ha denominado a esta gran región como la Huasteca o las Huastecas. Entonces comparte características con el estado, el sur de Puebla, con Hidalgo, con Querétaro, con San Luis Potosí y con Tamaulipas. Cabe mencionar que Ixhuatlán de Madero actualmente cuenta con una población originaria muy fuerte, muy importante. Su población originaria es de un 70% de población náhuatl, tepehuá, ñujú, totonaca y además de la población mestiza. Bueno, queremos destacar que tanto los gobiernos coloniales y después los nacionales en el siglo XIX y en el siglo XX establecieron todo un marco jurídico para reorganizar u organizar el territorio y la propiedad agraria. Así que cada régimen trató de imponer un sistema que según ellos rendiría mayores recursos fiscales y prosperidad a las comunidades. Pero como veremos, los habitantes rurales tuvieron sus propios puntos de vista sobre los procesos de cambio que los gobernantes proponían. Bien, ya entrados al tema, restitución o dotación de tierras en Ixhuatlán de Madero. Hace un momento les decía que esta ley se inicia con la ley 6 de enero de 1915, en la que se anulaba cualquier traslado de tierras que hubiese ocurrido en contravención a la ley de 1856, a una ley que se aplicó en la segunda mitad del siglo XIX y hasta finales del siglo XIX. Pero para 1915, lo que se planteó entonces a partir de esa ley es que los antiguos bienes comunales, ejidos y fondos legales de los pueblos debían retornar a sus legítimos poseedores, en el caso, pues a la población originaria. Sin embargo, a la población originaria en la región de estudio. Sin embargo, para que justo evidenciaran la legitimidad de esa posesión, pues debían de ampararlo o de presentar sus títulos virreinales. En caso de que no lo tuvieran, tenían la opción entonces la población que así lo decidiera solicitar una donación de tierras a partir de la dotación. Entonces, ¿qué hizo Ixhuatlán de Madero con una población de mayoría originaria? ¿Solicitó dotación de tierras o restitución? ¿Fueron despojados de sus tierras o qué pasó? ¿Qué pasó en el periodo, en lo anterior a esta ley? Bueno, lo que nosotros vamos a encontrar en resumen, es que la ley 6 de enero y las demás disposiciones sobre estas normas y forma de restitución o dotación es que a Ixhuatlán le permitió la creación y recreación de pueblos y de comunidades en espacios que pertenecían a terratenientes no indígenas desde la colonia. Eso es importantísimo. O sea que fue un momento en que a una población importante de nahuas pudieron amparar sus tierras, más bien pudieron amparar tierras que tenían en uso frente a un despojo a partir de la ley de la reforma agraria. Y lo que les estoy comentando es que lo que yo me encontré en este trabajo es que a partir de 1922, después de esta franja del margen del río Vinazgo, es que van a surgir alrededor de desde 1922 hasta 1940 van a surgir 44 peticiones de solicitud de dotación de tierras en estos espacios que eran desde la colonia a propiedad privada de población no originaria. Aquí se formaron las grandes haciendas, una de ellas la de Cacahuatengo, que constituyó de más de 15 sitios de ganado mayor, que en hectáreas son como 21,000 hectáreas, ¿no? Entonces, había aquí desde el siglo XVIII población originaria en calidad de terrasgueros o de colonos, trabajaban para estas haciendas, y el siglo XX, con esta política de reforma agraria, ellos pudieron amparar las tierras que venían usando y que venían trabajando como bajo préstamo o bajo arrendamiento. Entonces, eso es muy interesante, que les permitió a esta población amparar ese espacio que ya venían ocupando. En el qué pasa entonces, hasta aquí van a ser solo solicitud de dotación de tierras. Eso es bien interesante. Y para el caso, entonces, de donde teníamos población originaria o donde hay población originaria, que es al sur del municipio, de lo que es el municipio de Ixhuatlán, Está la población Nahua, la población Ñujú, Tepehua y Totonaca. La población Totonaca este municipio, el municipio de Ixhuatlán va a dividir sus tierras comunales en grandes lotes, o conocido como condoñazgo, que es una propiedad que contiene una extensión grande, pero de igual número de propietarios, o sea que es una copropiedad, una sociedad. Lo que va a ocurrir es que para el caso, por ejemplo, de los tepehuas de San Pedro, ese condoñazgo va a ser constituido como un condoñazgo multiétnico. Lo interesante es que nosotros vamos a encontrar una petición de restitución de tierra de esta parte de un grupo de campesinos que va a solicitar una dotación. Sin embargo, ellos eran pequeños propietarios. Entonces, ¿por qué solicitar dotación de tierra cuando eres propietario? Además, estas propiedades eran de 40 hectáreas. ¿Por qué? Bueno, pues se dio la conformación de un condeñazgo en esta la conformación de un cacicazgo en esta gran propiedad que estaba ya amenazando pues la forma de organización al interior de los tepehuas. Entonces, este grupo decide emigrar a la parte baja de esta gran copropiedad y crear un nuevo pueblo bajo ahora la modalidad de ejido. Entonces, es bien interesante que no hay una respuesta única y tampoco popular al agrarismo revolucionario. Eso es muy importante. Bueno, ya como conclusiones, la reforma agraria propició una mayor multietnicidad. ¿Por qué? Porque en el caso de los tepehuas invitaron a otros vecinos totonacos y ñujús a unirse a su petición de dotación de tierras, que el concepto de campesino, ejidatario, comunero, indígena o macehual están en constante definición debido a que dependerá siempre de su interlocutor, y que estos espacios de coincidencia de tanto de comunidades nahuas, tepehuas, ñujús, les ha permitido mantenerse y seguir ahí ha sido a partir de esa relación con su entorno y a través de sus ceremonias rituales, como el caso de la petición de lluvia, de estos espacios sagrados del Chicomechochitl, que es una ceremonia al maíz, o de la ceremonia de agradecimiento o de petición de agua, y también del carnaval, que es una ofrenda a la tierra. En esos encuentros, en esos espacios sagrados, también se dirimen los conflictos, se negocian los conflictos y se comienza por un nuevo ciclo agrario, por un nuevo ciclo comunitario. Muchísimas gracias. Eso es todo.
Hi, thank you so much. I'd like to turn finally to my colleague, Dr. Veronica Pacheco, and just encourage her to connect. I'm sorry, I'm thinking about 10 different things right now. So I'm going to turn it just over to Veronica, and thank you very much for participating in the panel.
So can you hear me well? Good afternoon, and just let me share my PowerPoint. So I would like to thank Dr. Angela Parker and all the panelists, to Tom Romero and Nye Rice, to Roger Holland, and to the invaluable contribution of Cherry Coulter, Clara Kapuska, and Brianna Johnson in the realization of this event. And a special thank to the Nahua people of Chicontepec, Veracruz, for receiving me and letting me learn from the ways of life. My presentation, titled Sonic Knowledge and Rain Ceremonies, is very much aligned with what Jacinta was telling us about how Nahuas, Tepehuas, Totonacos, and Ñujú in northern Veracruz have maintained their jurisdiction over the land in constant interaction among the groups and articulating the state policies to their benefit. In particular, I want to consider the local histories and to propose that sonic knowledge of the landscape has enabled an intimate relationship with the land and has reinforced principles of socialization based on communal life, which ultimately are essential to support sustainable life in the area. I will focus on the integrative characteristics of ritual music known as xochilzones, that translate as flower music pieces, of one of the rain ceremonies named the Chicomezochil, that takes place for the Postecli Mountain, a ceremonial center in the area located in the municipality of Chicontepec, up north from the area where Jacinta was telling her story about this land, the articulation that people uses for the land. And also I'm gonna point out to the uses of sound, such as bells, rattles, whistles, to wake up the landscape and announce that the ritual has arrived. And I will point to the way of how communal dancing and the voice of the celebrant are essential for a successful ceremony. Women have a particular task in the production of sound during the ceremony, as we will see. So the area where I'm going to talk about is really a little bit up north from the area in Ixcuatlán de Madero, that the case that Jacinta discussed. In this area is the municipality of Chicontepec, and they are located in northern Veracruz in La Huasteca. The municipality encompasses 332 rural communities with populations that vary between 100 and 1,000 people. Ixcacuatitla, so I developed my studies in the town of Ixcacuatitla, located at the foothill of the Postetli Mountain, which enabled me to witness the participation of several Nahua, Ñujú, and Tepehua people in the religious life surrounding this mountain. The ceremonies dedicated to the natural landscape and associated with the corn and rain cycles were some of the most prominent public gatherings. The economy in Chicontepec is still based on agricultural production and cattle ranches, and without a system of irrigation, local farmers are still actively engaged in the rain ceremonies. The evangelization of Chicontepec has shaped the religious practices from the time of the Spanish colonial period to the present day. There are Catholics, evangelicals, Pentecostals, and a small group of Jehovah's Witnesses. In Ixcacuatitla, the Catholic Church is perceived as having two different trends, one associated with the old church, which is probably a reference to the colonial practices, and the other, the new church, associated with a more recent incursion, which began in the 1980s. The old division of the Catholic Church is only associated with an animistic type of religion that includes a large pantheon of deities, some of which inhabit mountains and springs and caves. This religion is locally known as el costumbre, understood as an our religion, or associated with the different local descriptions of rituals. Like other Mesoamerican indigenous religious practices, mountains, springs, and caves are sacred places and foci of religious congregations. The temple for this celebration is the Xochicalli, which translates flower house. The pantheon of deities represent with cut paper images of mainly humanoid features, known in Nahuatl as Tlatecme or in Spanish as recortes, which translate really as cuttings, are believed to intervene in the life of towns for good and for ill. One of the major public ceremonies of the El Costumbre is the Chicomezochil ceremony, which is offered to mountains in petition for rain. The central character is the corn deity of the same name. During several days, many events take place which conclude with offerings in altars for the pantheon of deities in the Xochicalli, water sources, cave, and the mountain. Sound is present in the process of preparing the offerings when the ritual specialist cuts the paper and while the congregation makes their offerings. The main context of the ritual music, xochilzones in fact, are the flower musical pieces, or sones de costumbre, which translate as the music of the tradition, are the rain ceremonies. As active celebrants, ritual musicians are also considered ritual specialists. The instrumentation is often the Huastecan trio, which include a violin, a jarana, which is this small cordophone, and the huapanguera, which is the larger cordophone. Although it was commonly used only the violin and the huapanguera, but it has become more prominent to incorporate also the jarana. There are no lyrics. In these ceremonies, musicians play over 100 Xochitl sones to call distant mountains located in different states such as Chiapas and Oaxaca, or well-known ceremonial centers such as the Popocatépetl Sacred Mountain, believing that if you do not play music for them, the rain will not come. Similarly, the ritual musicians interact with the geography of the Postetli mountain, where they play a Xochitl song describing altars for deities located in the Xochicali, the water sources, and the mountain. So I'm going to illustrate here some of the pieces just for you to have an idea of the type of melodies and type of sound that is produced to actually kind of dramatize all what is happening in the ceremony. So this is the first example that is, they are describing exactly what the action is happening. So this piece is played when offerings are to be are presented to the paper cuts, to the gods, and to the mountain.
Ooh.
And this is the other one, is when people are dancing in front of the well. So the numerous pieces vary in character and tempo, and if they were dramatizing the mood of the different events that take place. There are sones for the Tlitl, which is the deity of the fire, and sones for many other deities. Even if the differences are very subtle, each piece corresponds to a specific instant that is taking place in the ceremony and in a particular place in the sacred landscape surrounding the water resources and the Postecli mountain. Women do not play instruments in the social sones, but rather they are in charge of other sounding tasks such as ringing the bell and shaking a rattle. Additionally, they are responsible to maintain tireless movements with their dancing in groups, in particular with the offerings are placed on the altars located along the ceremonial path. The sound and voice of the celebrant, who occasionally blows the whistle, carries a particular power, as this individual possesses a special gift to communicate with the sacred landscape. In this case, also women take the role as celebrants, either because they were born with this gift or they are descendants of powerful healers and celebrants recognized for their work. In the ritual, the congregation, attempting to influence the climate and indirect interaction with the mountain and water sources, show how this society still integrates their old ways of life. The sonic knowledge of the sacred geography and the communal relationship that people have maintained with it will pass through generations in all forms of sitting and listening to their elders, participating in agricultural rituals, or by incorporating this knowledge into new spaces of the youth. Thus, lo que sabían los abuelos, as is often locally referred, will inform the new generations of how to together maintain and further create sustainable social life in this area. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Veronica. I feel like that really pulled together several different strands in the materials that our scholars have shared tonight. In particular, for those of you who want to explore some of these practices more, I'm dropping in the chat a website that was built to highlight some of the materials that help to explain or can bring you in a little bit deeper to what our panelists have been describing and talking about and thinking through tonight. Some of the themes that I noticed when looking overall at what the panelists have presented connect with what Veronica was just talking about in terms of sonic knowledge in specific landscapes. And in particular, as with the sort of theme of our panel, this notion of sonic resistance and resistance to the colonial apparatus. And it seems to me that there are three central themes that I've seen over and over again. One is about the importance of land and context. And as tied to that land and context, this notion of healing and the building of community strength or the rebuilding of community strength. And throughout all of the presentations, we've seen that healing and strength, that theme, is often built through what our panelists have alternately called ceremony or ritual or practice. And inherent in that ceremony or ritual or practice is the importance of consistency, the importance of community and meaning making, and especially the importance of bodily practice within that landscape. And I just want to note here that unlike with sort of popular perceptions of or portrayals of, unlike the way that Indigenous communities have been portrayed by broader society, these practices of meaning making and understanding of place and landscape are built and essentially founded on the intellectual and cultural labor of women. The last thing that I want to say in my transition to our first question for the panelists is that the final theme that seems extremely important is this notion of community, both in terms of the concepts or the practices, those bodily practices that each panelist is studying and thinking through, but also in the fact that all of your research and your work is deeply community engaged. And so as we transition to the Q&A, and I invite all of our attendees to submit questions that they might have, I'll start us off with my main question. So when we think about these various examples of sonic resistance, from jingle dress to res metal, to land rights claims, to ceremony to sort of ensure continued survival within a landscape, who is the audience for these examples of sonic resistance? My secondary question as you answer that is, does it matter who the audience is?
I'll jump in. And I don't know that my thought is fully formed on this, but it was great. Also, I just want to say the other panelists listening to your really wonderful presentations. But you know what I was thinking about with the jingle dress in particular is in terms of audience. I don't know if that's quite the right word. It was certainly, you know, the way it evolved, and we have stories about the first jingle dress dancer who was in fact a little girl, right? Is a little girl near death. Her father has a vision, and in a community setting, the way they tell it at Mille Lacs is there was a big drum event going on that weekend, and the little girl was brought in, and then she kind of hears the jingle dress, and by the end of the night, she's up dancing too. And that's, you know, one of the things that made me realize it must have been this big flu epidemic, because it's a very flu-like story. So I think, in a sense, for the jingle dress in particular, it was really about the family and the community. But what we found, you know, and this is, you know, like I was showing you the photographs of the Navajo jingle dress dancers who are so, when I listen to other American Indian women talk about it, it seems like if you have some incredible thing like the jingle dress dance, it doesn't stay in one place, right? That culture moves around. Other people are really taken with the message of it. And so that's, to me, and I think what we have to realize, you know, when other people adopt the jingle dress, that it's not really what we would call an you know, a cultural appropriation, that it's too wonderful a tradition to keep to ourselves. And also, if the tradition is about healing and love for your family and love for your community, you have to have that same love for other people who want to adopt it or who are moved by it in some way. So that's just my quick reaction to it. It's, you know, we can't decide these things, right? These traditions take on a life of their own.
I can jump in there too. And so the audience is still very much for the inside community. So it's knowledge that it needs to be treated very delicate in terms of music, in terms of sound, because they have the ability to access all these realms that exist with the pantheon of deities. So it's very delicate to actually play this ritual music. They will not, these musicians might play other type of popular music, but they cannot play this music in other contexts that are not, they're not related to the mountain, for example. Also, when they perform this, in terms of all the community, because there are so many things happening. For example, the elders dancing is because they want this deity, which is portrayed as a baby. The Chicomesochil is actually a baby, but is a baby corn, is the illustration of the corn. They are dancing for the corn, but they are dancing for the well-being of everybody, not only the indigenous population in in these communities, but they were dancing for me to have good in my life. And they also, when they accept you to be part of this, as you can imagine, it takes a while. It's not as easy as it might seem. You have to be actively participating as well, because you will contribute to this. So I think that the audience is still very much inside the community, because the knowledge is still maintained in that way, and it's very delicate because it's very powerful as they understand it. And does it matter? Because what I found is that the new generations engage differently with this type of practices, because some of the generations have migrated, some others have different religions, but the sacred landscape and this active relationship with the sacred landscape is still there. And I have an example of two high school students coming into the mountain to just fool around. And they actually were killed. One of the rocks just fell down from the mountain and killed both students. So all people in town, when I arrived to the town, everybody was telling me this story. And that was just a reflection of even that there are so many perceptions of the nature of the sacred landscape. Still, there is a well-defined connection with the knowledge of what does it mean for the people living in this area.
Yeah, thank you for that. I appreciate all the other panelists too. Thank you so much. So in terms of audience, I mean, Res Metal is really interesting because it's publicly on YouTube. So you can like Google it, you can watch it, it can be circulated. People want views on their YouTube. They want you to share their music. But it's interesting because with certain Res Metal bands that I work with, they actually might have some like traditional knowledge, like coming from my presentation, that part of Res Metal is rooted in traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge, and there's some knowledge in there that they don't share, in particular with the Pueblos. Some of my Pueblo people, you know, when they have a song about, you know, raising awareness of the fracking of Chaco Canyon. And there's a song where they have very cryptic lyrics, and there's a thing that's called toxic transcription, where you start to ask, you know, too much as a researcher about like, well, where does that come from? What does that mean? What does Chaco Canyon mean to your people? And, you know, it's so easy to fall into, I think, like these traps, right? And when one of my, you know, Res Metal bands kind of used Refusal, was like, I can't talk about Chaco Canyon in that way, but I'm going to tell you it's important to us, and the land is important to us, and this song is here to protect, right, what's important to us, and not to like kind of go in deeper in that sense. So while the song is like the public expression of what's happening, right, if you kind of go more in depth to kind of ask some of these like very sensitive, I would say, information and knowledges, right, that's when you kind of start to learn within these songs that there are deeper meanings to it that are not to be shared in that way, but that the song itself can be.
It also, as you were all talking, it strikes me that you have some very difficult tasks embedded in your research, right? So there's not just the necessity of making place and landscape and community legible, right, to an academic audience, but part of it is you're all documenting survivance, or this sort of combination, right, of survival and resistance to this overarching colonial apparatus. And embedded in the practice of resistance is always hope, right? So there's a hope that things will get better. There's a hope that the world will be balanced, right? So I'm wondering if it's generative for you, if you could talk a little bit about how you're thinking about hope and resistance in your own projects.
So I'll jump in because I was thinking a lot about hope in the past year, right? Because this is such, you know, to kind of think about what Ojibwe and American Indian people know about survival, about coming to terms with, you know, I remember, you know, a scholar at one point saying, when we were kind of getting a handle on the demographic picture of Native populations, you know, I'm talking about scholarship of several decades ago, when we began to realize that the population was much greater than scholars had estimated, and that there had been a great depopulation of the Americas. And I was just, you know, I've been kind of thinking about how people said, well, how do we know how American Indians, for example, experience epidemic disease? What do we know? We'll never know, because that was just too long ago and there are no written records. And I've often thought of how the jingle dress dance tells us something about how Native people, it may be a modern tradition, right, coming out of the era of World War II, when we were part of a global epidemic. But yet I think it's very indigenous in the way it shows how Native people are coping. And I was trying to think last year when, you know, when we were all hunkering down, right, in the springtime, and most of us a year ago, I know we were in my family watching the nightly news, and especially how dire things were in New York City at that time, and the hospitals. And so I was fortunate in that I had a op-ed published in the New York Times. And I thought, I want to tell people about the jingle dress dance tradition, because for us, that story of the little girl is so sustaining. It's a story of hope. It's about survival, But most of all, I think it is a story of hope. And at times like these, we have to think about the world, the global, how we're all in this together. And so I think this is why I've been sort of talking nonstop about the jingle dress dance tradition in the last year, but also people are interested in it because they want a message, a hopeful message, I think, at this time. And so some of these things go out beyond our own communities, right? Because we do want to offer hope to a broader audience of people who want to learn about these things and realize Western society is not the beginning and end, right? People are searching for answers. How do we cope with this devastation? Well, we have some people who sadly have a lot of experience with this, right? And they haven't ever lost hope for the future. So hopefulness is part of our resistance.
I love that. Vicky or Veronica, is that question helpful or interesting to either of you, or?
I can address this, yes. I'm sad that Jacinta is not with us because she could give an answer to this part. In particular, because her study is understanding the dynamics that the indigenous communities coming from different Nahus, Tepehuas, Nahuas in this area actually interact with each other and with the government to protect their lands. And they come together exactly in these moments of the ritual because there is always a necessity for it. Most of these areas still farmer. There is based on the economy in this area is based on farming. So when I think about hope and think about resistance, it's always all the time kind of almost like a circular movement in between what does it mean development for these areas and what does it mean culture and the value that culture has for these communities. And one thing I always come up from these towns, that in particular when I attend these ceremonies, is like you come, even sometimes there are there's difficult situations. You came up with an ideal hope that things are going to become better. And I believe that this concept of better doesn't need to be in any directions besides the one that might be decided inside these towns. But I do think that it's important to recognize this diversity that exists and not necessarily matches any other global development that we might think or consider, but that the very, like the core of these practices are really important maybe for all the world to understand. In this way of confronting in our realities, because that is it's just a different way of perceiving the reality, which I think is very valuable and very hopeful also.
I think it's really interesting too, that connection, that deep connection between the local and the global, right? In what both of you have sort of contributed. Vicky, did you have any thoughts about where you see hope in sort of these spaces of res metal and intertribal interaction?
Yeah, so as we know, Navajo Nation was like really hit with the pandemic at like astronomical, devastating rates. And talking to people on Zoom actually during this time was a lot of my interviews last summer and fall. So talking to musicians right now is really interesting because they're in this place of reflection and deep thought. And they're actually also coming out with music. So now there's like this COVID era music where everyone was inside with their instruments processing, I think, what's happening. And all of them really spent a lot of time saying, this is a great time to make an album. This is a great time to make new music. And I'm really excited to see when they start releasing these albums and these times. So part of me, I think, like with the work that I do, really does look at nostalgia and looks at, I think, Native American understanding of time and space. Because this scene in general really took off in the early 2000s to 2010, and then it kind of dwindled. So everyone looks to this era because their childhood, their teenage, adolescent year was framed by this scene. And because it's dwindled, and then with the pandemic, there is this very much so hope that there will be, you know, concerts in the future, time to share music with each other, see each other. And a lot of what I realize is like this nostalgia or this like longing for this past is really about being together and about sharing music and about being in this space with each other, sharing their talents and new songs that they come out with. So I think it's really just like, the hope is that that will happen again, that new music will come out, and that, you know, we'll have this greater appreciation for concerts and being in spaces together. And as for like, you know, Suspended, you know, I think it's really amazing to see what's happened, I think, in their life as they're transitioning as all of them now are mothers. So before I like started this project, you know, only one of them was a mother with 2 daughters. And now both of them, all 3 of them actually are all mothers at this time. And to see like how they're still trying to practice childcare, and then also like see where there's a tour in the future again, I think it's really exciting to see like kind of what happens, I think, moving forward. So I think there's like a lot of things that are also happening in their personal life that they look forward to. But that this music and this vision and this ability to come together is still that hope.
I feel like it also just underlines how precious community is, right? And in each of these examples that our panelists have brought up for us, you get a sense of what can be endangered, right? Particularly during a global pandemic, but as well, how important our connections to other people are, as well as our connections to our lived environment. Such that people go to great lengths to do the work, right? To create these spaces of community, to create these bodily practices of hope and resistance. We're running up towards the end of our panel time, and I just want to give a sincere thanks to all of our panelists, as well as to Roger and ODEI, as well as COS, for fostering and giving us the opportunity to create this space, even if it's virtually right now. And I hope I'm speaking for all of our attendees when I say I'm emerging from this discussion with a deep feeling of hope and community and groundedness. So thank you everyone for attending.